Thank you. I'd first like to thank Astrid so much and the ICA for allowing this work to be developed here. So thank you to you.
And thank you, Oka. Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
I love the way that you kind of use your humor to point to the absurdities of colonialism and colonial discourses. You had me creasing.
Oh, from one pathology to another. Leaping over pathologies.
Yeah, so I have a few words about your performance and your work in general, and your work specifically relating to Anna. And I found it really beautiful how you were weaving those lower frequency narratives out of the painting, those narratives that center Anna and her subjectivities. You spoke really potently to the continuities of colonial legacies and the impact that they continue to have on black and brown women's bodies, of how, like Anna, we are often frozen within a restrictive colonial framework. But your work, laced with an eruptive impulse, your performance, was a beautiful ode to Anna. And Anna in her fullness, her ambiguity, her youth, her sexuality, her queerness, her womanhood, her complexity, her history. You created a multi-dimensional space for Anna to sit and rest in. Anna is or has been canonized within a frame that freezes her within certain restrictive, reductive narratives of colonial desire, exoticism, and sexual primitivism, reducing her to a pathology. She's always already framed within the gaze of the white colonial imagination, but you are so subtly, tenderly, and gently teasing out these subjectivities that are lost in the colonial misremembering of her. You're locating knowledge in her brown, queer, woman-child's body. So you were doing the work of creating space for her to breathe. And as she breathes, it creates space for us all who carry the residues of coloniality in our bodies to follow that same line of flight. So thank you so much.
Oh my gosh. Okay, can we go home now? That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm very honored to have you here and to have you say those words.
Oh, it's true. And I guess what would be quite good to start with is how you happened upon Anna. How did you encounter her?
Yeah, gosh, this really, I can't believe it's been 7 years, but it really has been 7 years of every single day thinking about this one painting. So in 2011, I found out that a scholar and filmmaker, an Indonesian-American scholar and filmmaker named Fatimah Tobingroni, who's written some really great books about race and representation in cinema, whose work I'd been following. She was writing a book that at the time was called Annah and Javanese, and since then, Annah and Javanese is the title of a chapter within a larger book on visual biopolitics that she's writing. And I was so stunned because I'd never seen a Javanese woman depicted as being in the West and in such a way, and as a woman rather than a child. I mean, she was, you know, everybody says she was around 13 because of age of consent, to, you know, who knows how old she really was. And I really felt a strange kinship at I immediately understood that she was not understood, and that how she has been characterized throughout history, as I uncovered more and more clashing facts about her, right? Nobody can get anything right about her. It became really fascinating to me, and it opened up this beautiful way in which actually nobody can know what happened to her and who she was except for her herself. So in that way, it kind of also opened up space for empathy with what we as black and brown women experience from her as kind of a kindred spirit. I don't know, I just couldn't stop thinking about her. And I've since also interviewed Fatimah Tobingroni, and she was like, go for it, because we're approaching the issue from very different angles. I'm cripping and trying to crip and queer Anna. And so cripping, for those of you who don't know, is putting an angle to some, there's compulsory heteronormativity, there's also compulsory able normativity. We assume that people are abled until proven disabled. So as a woman who's invisibly disabled, that's like my whole life. And I just, for some reason, I thought she could definitely be in chronic pain. She could definitely have been disabled because she was living supposedly with a man whose son has gone on the record as saying he was a domestic abuser, and who has painted all these other very young girls and put them in vulnerable positions. And in that way, I realized, wow, these myths and fantasies about who we are as Javanese women and Indonesian women and brown and black women, because you see how we're so interchangeable somehow. There's another part in Mario Vargas Llosa's book where it talks about how her lips were really thick, so she must have had African descent. It's just, the dehumanization is so interwoven, and it actually became a source of real potential for solidarity, I think, amongst black and brown women, that we all could be Anna in some way. So I just have been teasing that thread out and trying to experiment with what she's been trying to tell me. So I decided in this piece to just speak to her rather than as her, which I have in the past.
And it really did feel like Anna was present, like she was in the room, and I think that that's really beautiful. That's a really kind of powerful way of engaging with art, listening to it, right? I think we're so consumed in like westernized spaces to consume culture through the optic, right? And I feel like you are kind of subverting that in your way of relating to her. So you're creating space through other senses to kind of evoke her spirit. Do you feel, and there's an amazing scholar, Tina Kamp, and in her work, Listening to Images, she kind of argues for a different way of engaging with images, right? This multi-sensory kind of sense of relating. And is that something that you kind of consciously integrated into your work?
Yes, I mean, in 2011, when I really began to delve into disability justice frameworks for the arts, I decided to make my pieces as much as possible accessible. So if you see outside, there's a sign where you can read the whole script, and it's captioned if you are visually impaired. So that was just a part of the way that I've been working for so long, and I just feel as though multisensorial ways of being and a recognizing, us as seeing people, and that non-seeing people have many different cultures as well that are just as valid rather than defective, I think is a really engaging field of inquiry.
And as you've been relating to her in a different way, do you feel like you're kind of able to see different kind of facets of her being? Do you feel like you're coming to understand her in a different way, like as you're teasing these different narratives that she holds?
I think that this piece is not the first, but I would say that with every piece I do about her, including the visual pieces that were in the film, I get more and more reminded by her that nobody can claim her story. And actually, like, if you look at all those archival photos that were supposedly of Annah Javanese, I honestly think they're all different girls. You look at, honestly, like, you look at their faces, and it's all, it's, and at first, I was, embarrassed myself because I, being a PhD researcher, supposedly we look at archives and we're like, okay, this has some sort of authority, and even as somebody who's trying to claw away at that authority, I still thought at first these are all the same girl, and then the more I looked at these photographs, they're not the same. I don't think they're the same person, especially when, I don't know if you caught this, but one of the photos was labeled as Polynesian, and then as Anna, so it's, and as a very specific Polynesian woman, Toho Tawa, I think is how you pronounce your name. So it really is bizarre how so I'm writing a book called Anna Infinite, and which will be hopefully the culmination of this PhD. Hi Alice, my PhD supervisor is so wonderful. Thank you for coming. And very, very patient, so patient. But so in this book, there are so many scenarios for her, but without giving too much, I just feel as though there are so many possibilities for plurality in understanding her story. And it's completely ridiculous to me that all these, different girls' faces, different cultures, are trying to be narrowed down to this Anna figure.
Right.
And this one story about this Anna figure. And it's just, there's so many more stories that I didn't include because, I wanted to kind of encapsulate things in as succinct a way as possible. There's so many other different stories about this one girl that contradicts other stories. So I think the more work I do, the more I respect the fact that we will never know her or them Whether it was multiple girls, all called Anna, whether it was one girl, we will never ever know. But in that, what do we learn from it? You know.
And I think there's a lot of unlearning to be done, right? Especially when we see the different ways in which these colonial discourses play themselves out. And what I found to be like incredibly powerful was the juxtaposition of like contemporary kind of news headlines and contemporary kind of plight of women of color around the world with Anna's kind of embodiment.
Yeah. There's one source that I mentioned where it's so like seamlessly, she was a domestic servant, right? Who was then supposed to be his mistress. Like it's so abusive and so strange, and like she was found in the streets or brothels, like, you know, everything is just, it's so clear that domestic work was as devalued then as it is now, and how prone women around the world are, particularly to human trafficking, to abuses in the UK, in Western countries, everywhere, and how, you know, in the way that you speak about Anna being a mistress, it also devalues like sex workers. It devalues, you know, women's agency. It devalues because you're narrating these dehumanizing threads for different employment routes for employment, you know, routes for her.
Yeah.
And nobody ever asked about her family. Like if she was brought in as a domestic worker for Nina Pak, the opera singer from Java, I mean, was she the illegitimate child of a Dutch officer and a Javanese woman? Possibly, you know, I mean, what happened? And she's always alone in these pictures. She's always with white men. She's only with white men. She never has a friend. And I just thought, I was just really, I know, but we're her friends now. I really kind of feel like she's here in some way.
And what you're saying, it kind of speaks to the different ways in which different temporalities are located within that painting of Anna, right? So there's a temporality of everything that preceded Anna being held in the portrait, right? And then there's the point of consumption, the temporality of us as viewers consuming the portrait. And then there's the afterlife of the image, right? And all of these things are so intertwined and connected and kind of really speak to the haunting of Anna. Right?
Absolutely. And it's not only about subsuming all these different colonies that we come from into this one girl, who could be from any of them, Sinhalese, Polynesian, who cares, right? It's also about how actually kind of monolithic different colonial powers were. Because, you know, Java was colonized, I mean, various colonizers were in Indonesia at some point. You know, the British were in there, the Dutch were in there, and the French, you know, were fascinated at some point in the late 1800s with Java and with Javanese dancers specifically, because they came to the World's Fair and we're gorgeous. So what, you know, I'm kidding. The dancers are, but so then this fascination with Javanese women, even though sometimes you couldn't tell whether it was Cambodia or Java, right? With Paul Gauguin's photographs, became sort of like, okay, so she could have been from a Dutch colony, but we also claim the right to colonize her. So there's also this thread of like French, Dutch, British, whoever, colonizer, kind of in cahoots, and being, you know, sort of like a divide et impera, divide and conquer, but also with young women's bodies.
Right.
And I think that's also what the story is talking about.
Yeah, because historically, black and brown women's bodies have just been a site for the colonial imagination,
Right, exactly.
For different kind of iterations of desire to be projected onto. And that makes me think about like Anna within a kind of like, or how important it is to frame her within a kind of empowered sexual frame. So if Anna were here, what would pleasure be like to her?
Yeah.
What is her sexuality?
Potentially 13, you know, still figuring things out, possibly, and only surrounded by wet men. And it, I wanted to show that in order for you to walk into a museum and see, it's supposedly private. I've really been trying to track this painting down for so long. They keep it very well hidden. In order for you to, if that goes on display in a museum, and for you to admire that, if you're a schoolgirl, even admiring that as art, what do you have to subscribe to not be upset at this? You have to subscribe to able normativity, but that in itself is also, it's not like disabled people can't experience pleasure also, but I do think there's definitely some able normativity going on. And definitely heteronormativity, if you assume that, you know, she was his willing mistress and all of this stuff. And then you have to just go along with the fact that, okay, these myths about Javanese women are propping up the legend of Paul Gauguin, who, despite bringing syphilis to so many people, you know, is revered and loaded in another sense. That painting is worth so much money. That painting is worth so much money. And my goal with this project is in part to lower the price of that painting. Because if you talk about the art market, I've been also doing work that is not in this particular piece, but about how her image echoes and doesn't echo the different ways Black and brown women and girls' bodies circulate with regards to the financial market. Like if you put, there's a piece I did where, you know those charity ads like, care, help Celine become a doctor, and it's just a photo of a Black or brown girl, it could be anywhere, like, you know, help her become a doctor because she's pigmented, so poor, you know, and then I replaced it with Anna's image, and so it became, help Anna become a doctor, and then you're like, whoa, wait, but she's naked, huh? And then you realize, but she's also part of that circulatory financial system that we're all in, because her body is worth something now. And in order for her body to be worth that, we have to believe in Gauguin's genius, we have to believe in his, in the ultimate righteousness of presenting these paintings not as child pornography, but as works of art. And no content warning anywhere.
And I guess it's through flipping the script, right? That I guess you can kind of use these kind of ways in which capital circulates to kind of, I guess, get at the beast and the underbelly of this system that exploits women's bodies, right? And
oh no, I was just gonna say, I just thought of this term like underbelly capital, which I think Anna has. Because I think in the inconsistencies, she or they have underbelly capital, or, you know, like Fred Moten's undercommons, yes, of being very subversive in her supposed lack of agency. I think there's actually a lot of agency there.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, it goes back to what you were saying about how if people are framed, if women of color are framed within such a kind of mono-dimensional lens, then that sense of agency, that sense of kind of empowered subjectivity becomes disavowed, right? And what is really beautiful about your work is that you kind of refuse to look at Anna through that lens, right? You're viewing her through nuance. You're viewing her through a kind of subversive power, right?
Thank you, yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, like, how can we kind of collectively use that lens to then, I guess, speak to the different ways that women like Anna in the present are kind of like embodying such exploitation,
I see
such pain.
Echoes of Anna every day in the news with how people are treating migrant children and just completely disavowing any rights for refugees. And it's all related. And I feel like it took me years to, I think I'm still unlearning constantly. Like even the thing with, I thought it was one girl, and then the day that I was like, these are different faces, it was just incredible. And I thought, oh, I've drunk the Kool-Aid. I really, I saw her as one girl, and it was just, it's quite scary.
Yeah, because not only does she hold multiple narratives, but multiple faces as well, right?
Yeah.
And within those different faces are different experiences that then become enmeshed in this one kind of grand narrative of Anna.
Yeah, but the fact that she supposedly stole from Gauguin also
that was pretty
incredible. Cool. There's more backstory to that there's so many different versions of that as well. But I just thought, this is the best story I've ever heard in my life. Of this girl robbing him when he was in the hospital because he got drunk in a fight with some sailors. What a silly bro.
And the fact that she escaped, right?
Yeah, well, in some versions she escaped. In some versions she then became Alphonse Mucha's mistress, which is one of them. I know, it never ends.
But that's kind of like a different iteration of marriage, right? So she's escaping her space of servitude, right?
Yeah.
To create a different future, a different reality for herself. And also, in certain versions, she loots everything within his home space, but leaves the art on the walls.
That's so wonderful. And so it's interesting because in Mario Vargas Llosa's book, The Way to Paradise, he writes about her stealing everything from Gauguin's studio except for his art, as literally she must have been a savage. She could not understand the value of this art, but that art was keeping them alive. She clearly, and when I tell this story to Black and brown women, most of the people I've spoken to have been, oh, that's such a great revenge move, you know, because she's showing that his art is worthless. She's not gonna take it. But then other people will say, well, actually, maybe she loved him. I've heard that from people I've told the story to, that she loved him so much she wanted to keep his artistry there, and that gets complicated too, because maybe people are able to love their abusers, and people, you know, so that gets very complicated, and I think worth digging into more.
Yeah, and I guess there's a fine line, right, between abuse and love, maybe.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, Here There Is Love was written in that studio, supposedly.
Right, and I guess then I think of Gloria Veca and her work on Mati societies, right, and matriarchal queer structures. And it was commonplace for there to be intergenerational sexual relationships between older women and younger women who were like 13, 14. And I guess I find it quite interesting just how these norms that I guess have been kind of like normalized or reified as the status quo are kind of like complicated and played with in different parts of the world.
Yes,
right?
definitely. And Gloria Veca also from the Netherlands, which is colonized Indonesia for 350 years. So her work is so interesting in the context of Annah as well, for sure.
Okay. And do you feel like looking at Annah and her relationship with Gauguin through a different lens, does it make you kind of sympathize with like what it is that kept her in that space?
I hope the word is empathize rather than sympathize. And yeah, I think it also speaks to the need to also take some distance from all these stories, because they're really sad, a lot of them. And the need to honor them as potentially very tragic stories, but also this mischief from all these girls in the photos. That I really feel like they're saying, you think we're all the same girl. And you know, hundreds of years from now, people are hopefully going to wake up and say, these are not the same person, or this story has a million different ways that it's being told, but what is common to all these different retellings? Able normativity, heteronormativity, sanctioned abuse, all these possibilities are in every single story, almost, except for, you know, the new ones that people like Fatima and I are trying to tell now about her.
And I think you mentioned before that you and Fatima, you work with Annah in different ways.
Yeah.
But there's a commonality in your kind of like platforming of her in a nuanced kind of way.
Yeah, because I work on cripping, which Fatima doesn't, and she thought that was a really interesting take, and she's been really encouraging of that take on her. And
has your cripping of Annah influenced her work or changed it?
I don't know. I haven't talked to her in years. I just interview people. But I follow her work, and I'm looking forward to her book. So I'm curious to see when that comes out, because it was entitled Annah and Javanese, but now it's just a chapter. And she's telling other stories that I'm not telling. And there's so much work to be done that's different. But I'm glad that we have that commonality of being, of acknowledging Anna's existence in the past.
It's just like something small that I just noted that anak is really similar to child in Indonesian, anak. So I just wondered if that was something that you kind of picked up
Oh my
upon.
gosh. I didn't. So the word anak in Indonesian means child, and also in Tagalog, people in the Philippines also say anak when they mean like dear child.
And it's just the way you were saying it was like really similar to the word.
Oh, wow. Oh, I'm going to think about that one. Thank you. So many layers.